The proposition, value movement, which you'd think would be a given in any curriculum that looks in health and physical education. But as Doone said, look at the verbs, look at what does value mean and how that actually is enacted and how it appears in our schools. So part of the proposition says, health and physical education promotes an appreciation of the centrality of movement in daily life, in all its forms, from meeting functional requirements to providing opportunities for social interaction, through to acknowledging participation in physical activity and sport as significant cultural practices. And that's like physical activity, movement is a very broad term. It's not just sport and games. And as a proposition, really, among other things when I looked it up, means a proposal. I'm going to I will ask you some questions to think about your situation, your context, and how the valuing of movement is actually evident. In other words, it can be seen. Movement is something that's obviously what we do, but it shouldn't be something that we keep to ourselves, that we're acquisitive about, that we're possessive about. And I've certainly found this in both my teaching situations in secondary and primary school. It's something, and we talk about collaboration and sharing, it's something we need to share with our colleagues in other teaching areas and probably in the school and across the school community. The curriculum itself was written for both generalist and specialist teachers, so it has to be pitched at a level so that people who haven't trained in the area of physical education can understand what the content descriptors mean and how they can use them. And this is where we come in, particularly in Queensland, as a sort of repository of information and assistance to other teachers. Doone also talked about integration. Now this to me is one of the most vital things about a curriculum, because it provides a pathway to us for interaction, collaboration in the primary school with the classroom generalist teacher. And I know from my experiences, which are not as extensive as a lot of the people in the room, how the isolation of being a primary school phys ed teacher, and I was in an urban area, in a leafy green suburb teaching, that isolation, that what you do is apart and different from what everybody else does in the school. And if we can encourage the valuing of movement, not only in our own teaching, but across the school, it will help break down these barriers that I found existed just with the structure of how the timetabling was set up. So there's 3 sub-strands in the movement and physical activity strand that are based on the work of Arnold. There's moving our body, understanding movement, and learning through movement. And they reflect the acquisition of movement skills, the applying of knowledge to enhance movement, and the social interaction that movement provides. What students gain from participating in movement in our lessons should be transferred across, not only to other lessons, but outside the school setting. So how do we actually value movement? I want you to think about your school. I want you to think, what opportunities are there for movement? There are obviously our physical education lessons, but what else in the school? What happens during the breaks? Is there organised sport? Are there before and after school activities? What other curricular areas value movement or incorporate movement in their teaching? What about active transport? And then about the teaching of movement skills. In Queensland, the teaching of fundamental movement skills is seen as the responsibility of the physical education specialist teacher. But what we're doing in class, how do we share that with others? You might have heard of a report that came out earlier on this year called Is Sport Enough? Can I just have an indication of people who are aware of this report? There's a few there. What it is it's a report card. You would have seen it in the paper because they reported on our physical activity as being generally a D. It's a report card on physical activity for children and young people where people responsible for the report gave some, can only say marks or ratings from, I think, A to F, we didn't get any Fs, on physical activity and things like overall physical activity levels, where we scored a D minus, active transportation a D, but a B minus for organised sport and physical activity participation. When it came to actual movement skills, there was no rating. They said INC, which is inconclusive. So what they were saying was, we don't have, and Alison talked about statistical data, we don't have enough data to actually come up with a rating. So what we would like to propose, and think about this, is we would like a movement skill competency battery that looked at locomotor and non-locomotor skills, and we'd like to collect data on how students perform in this battery. Now, you may think that's a good thing or a not so good thing, particularly if you think of our keynote speaker saying, depending on your perspective. But they're hoping with this data that they can get an idea of the motor skill competence of particularly primary school children. And I thought that was quite an interesting proposal. The other thing I found quite interesting is how we, as individuals, value movement. And I'm sure everybody in this room, you wouldn't be here unless you valued movement, unless it was an integral part of your life, something important to you. And Alison spoke about identity with some of the participants in her study. For a lot of us, you know, it's a large part of our identity. In fact, in the United States of America, their National Association for Sport and Physical Education came up in 2009 with a policy statement for physical education teachers and coaches and kinesiology faculty members and a higher education institute, people who worked in universities, that said that they should really live a physically active life or have a physically active lifestyle if they were going to be teachers of physical activity, which I thought is quite interesting. I don't think we require a policy statement like that in Australia, but it's part of their policy. If you're going to be a phys ed teacher, how do you show to your students, through your own activity, through your own valuing of movement, that it's important to you? The problem we face, of course, is that the curriculum is about lifelong appreciation of movement and physical activity, and that's really hard to evaluate. How do we produce evidence, because everything these days is data-driven and people want what they call concrete evidence, that our students value movement? How do we show that to the people that influence what happens in schools, that our students do value movement? How can we say that they value it for the term of their life, that what they take from the school is with them for life? And that's a question that I put to you, because I think that's one of our challenges that we face. Even though we've got lots of evidence about physical activity with a health perspective, what about physical activity in terms of its contribution to dealing with stress, to happiness, to all those things that you can't measure? So I'd just like to conclude by taking you back to your own context and thinking about how you show that you value movement in your school and how your students demonstrate that movement is valuable to them. Thanks.